Let's talk assessment types. Assessment gives us the opportunity to explore a student's capabilities so we can actually make decisions about how to best teach our students. Now, you may be wondering, why are there so many different types of assessments, and what's the difference between each type of assessment? Or why is it so important to understand the purpose of different types of assessments? Or how do I even decide what assessment to give? How can I use assessment results to improve my instruction? Well, what we know, and what I want you to know, is that when we're talking about evaluating a student, particularly for screening, diagnosis, or eligibility, or instructional considerations, what we're doing is carefully considering first the different types of assessment and their purposes. And we often need a combination of assessments to ensure that we do a well-rounded, comprehensive evaluation. We are going to get to all of that, but we want to start with learning objectives. By the end of this week, you should be able to discuss the similarities and differences between formal and informal assessments. Next, I want you to make sure that you can explain the purpose of each of the following types of assessments: norm-referenced, criterion-referenced, curriculum-based, performance-based, portfolio, error analysis, interview, direct observation, checklists, and behavior rating scales. Third, make sure you can identify the differences between norm and criterion-referenced assessments. And fourth, describe the different types of scores that can be obtained for a norm-reference assessment. And finally, be able to evaluate the effectiveness of using multiple types of assessment to examine student performance. Next, I want you to click on over in your textbook to page 51 and look at those key terms. Make sure that you can use those, you can explain those in your own words, and I recommend flashcards. Let's start with formal assessments. Formal assessments measure the student's overall performance, and it allows us to compare strengths or weaknesses with their peers. A lot of formal assessments are considered standardized or are used synonymously with that term. And the term standardized means, when we refer to formal assessments, that they are administered, scored, and interpreted in a standard, consistent manner. But it also specifically refers to assessments that have been statistically normed. So we get it's going to conform to a normal distribution across the overall general population, and this is what we mean by standardized when we're talking about norm-referenced tests. Now, informal assessment is typically teacher-created or textbook-generated and is governed by content and performance. Examples are CBMs, curriculum-based assessments, performance assessment, portfolio assessments like projects or interviews. And we use informal assessments to test our students' understanding of content that was taught. We can also use it to highlight specific skills, or we might want to examine a student's ability to generalize skills taught in the classroom. One of the most common types of assessment that's used to compare student performance, to compare performance of students to each other and evaluate students' areas of strengths and need, are norm-referenced assessments. These report whether test takers performed better or worse than a hypothetical average student, which is determined by comparing scores against the performance results of a statistically selected group of test takers. Typically, they're of the same age or grade level and they've already taken the exam. Now, norm-referenced assessments can measure things like intelligence, academics, behavior, or even social-emotional characteristics. To get scores on the assessments can be reported in a lot of different ways. Scores on these can be reported in raw scores, standard scores, scaled scores, percentiles, stay nines, age equivalents, and grade equivalents. Some examples of a norm-referenced assessment would be things like the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or the Woodcock-Johnson Test of Cognitive Abilities, Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scales, the Wyatt, which is an achievement test, or the Kaufman, which is also an achievement test, often abbreviated as the KTEA. When we look at the performance of students and we're wanting to compare them, we look at the distribution of scores and we compare the performance of different students to one another. We look at three areas: the mean, the median, and the mode. Look to your textbook and figure out what those exactly mean for you. What we usually do is we use graphic representations so that we can provide visual depictions of the distribution of scores on any given measure. The most commonly known one is the bell curve, and this is considered a normal distribution. Now, all norm-reference tests statistically conform to a normal bell curve. They're symmetrical in nature, as you can see, and they have the same value for the mean, median, and mode. Performance on assessments that are non-standardized or informal typically result in non-normal distribution of scores. When we're comparing students' performance to that of peers, we look at norm-referenced assessments because they frequently allow for us to compare a student's performance to peers who are either the same age or the same grade, but we have to consider the purpose and the content of the particular assessment and make sure that if the test is developmental in nature, we might, like things like intelligence or memory, it may be appropriate to actually compare the age level norms. If what we're testing is based on content, like something that's taught at a particular grade level, like math or social studies, then it's beneficial to refer to the grade level norms. But we have to consider the specific circumstances that are associated with the student, like if the student is older than most of the typical students in her or his grade level. We also want to consider the purpose of the evaluation. We have to be cautious when we're using these age and grade level norms because depending on the curriculum that's used, students in different school districts or different states may learn different skills at different times. When you're comparing student performance to same age peers, you have to determine the student's precise age because performance, especially at younger ages, varies considerably from month to month or even day to day. Look to page 61 in your textbook to find the formula for determining age. You can look to your text to get more information on norm reference test in terms of administration, basals, and ceilings, but what you need to remember is that in order for the performance of a norm reference assessment to be truly able to compare students to students, strict adherence to the guidelines is crucial. You have to become familiar with how the test is administered so that you can administer it correctly and get an accurate score on the assessment. Just as important is to make sure that you fully understand what a score refers to before using that score to describe student performance, because all the different types of scores mean something different and they need to be interpreted differently. Now, outside of norm reference testing, we've also got some other ways to assess, particularly criterion reference assessments. Now, these are commonly used to understand a student's level of competence in any given area. That is going to be criterion reference assessments, or sometimes they're called CRTs. These can be formal or informal, and when we use these, we're comparing a student's performance to a pre-established criteria or objective. We're not comparing it to other students like we do in the norm reference testing. We've also got things like curriculum-based assessment, and we'll do that in the whole second half of our class, but you'll still want to become familiar with it, so make sure you read that carefully in the text. We can also look at performance-based assessment, where we look at work samples that are created by the students to demonstrate skills or knowledge. This could be writing, presentations, art projects, debates, experiments, demonstrations, or really anything like that. We've also got authentic assessments, and these are really assessments that require some type of a real-world application for the student. We can use portfolios, and these are a collection of performance assessments that allow us to review the progress of a student's learning over time. We can also do error analysis. This gives us a lot of great information, but it's really time consuming. But there are times when you definitely want to do this, so make sure that you're looking carefully at that. There are other things we can do in terms of getting information about students with assessment. We can also interview students or parents or other teachers. We can really get a lot of information, and the interviews can be formal or informal. We can also do direct observations, and there's a lot of different ways to get that information, and if you haven't had behavior yet, then you will go over all of the different ways to collect observational data in that class, like event recording and anecdotal recording and intervals and all kinds of things with that, including things like inter-rater response time. We can also use rating scales, like behavior rating scales are pretty popular as well. Overall, what you've got are a lot of different types of formal and informal assessments, and we use these so that we can get a better understanding of students' strengths and needs. We want to use a combination of different types of assessments so that we can get data and information that give us the insight we need into student performance and their ability. When we're trying to figure out which types of assessment to use, we have to look first at the purpose of our assessment. So are we just doing a screening? Are we diagnosing and doing eligibility? Or are we trying to figure out our instructional considerations? Once we've done that, then we can figure out which assessment to use. Furthermore, when we're interpreting these assessment results, we have to take into consideration the characteristics of the assessment, like what type is it, what's the purpose, how is it administered, how was it scored, and then also we just need to be able to take a systematic approach to assessment selection to make the process manageable. We'll go over that, of course, in much more detail as we go through the semester. As you wrap up this chapter, go back to the learning objectives and work through those. Make sure that you can answer those questions or discuss those ideas. And if you're not able to do it confidently, then just go through that content and make sure that you can put it into your own words.